Thank you, everyone, for joining. If you have come to this session to learn about the myth of the $50 website, you are in the right place. If you've come here looking for a $50 website, you're in the wrong place. We don't have those here. You may not like this presentation. We'll start with introductions. So my name is Mark Head, consulting engineer team that was on with technology transfer. I've been 5 years in state and local. Really happy to see. I give a shout out to some of those from the Delaware Government Information Center here. Work good to get all. And I will turn it over to my colleague Ashley.
Mark, your video is a little choppy for some reason. It was totally fine before we started. But hi everyone, I'm Ashley Owens. I'm currently the acting executive director of 18F and the government. So I have more than one hat, more than one heavy hat. And so I'm also the acquisition director at 18F. And my alias is Acquisition Breaker of Chains, because I was a procurement official in the federal government for about 10 years or so before I came to 18F and drank the Kool-Aid on like all things agile and civic tech.
I'm going to turn my camera off just in the hopes that that will make the internet gods happy. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can totally hear you great, Mark.
All right, there is literally no reason for anyone to look at me, so I'll turn my camera off and we'll go that way. All right, let's get started. We wanted to start with just a quick quote. I don't know if folks have seen this movie, if you're a fan of old Westerns, but this is an old Western. And this quote kind of jumped out at me as I was thinking about this presentation. It's a quote about the Old West and about perpetuating legends in the Old West. There are lots of things about the Old West that we know from legend, and many of them are just that. They are just legends. They are not connected to facts in any way. And I thought that'd be a good segue into talking about digital service myths. So let's talk about a few digital service myths. Here's the first one. Myth number one: it can be difficult to deliver government digital services quickly, efficiently, and in a way that helps people in need. Ashley, did you want to say anything about this?
Yeah. All right. I don't know if you intended to advance the slides or not, but we still see the title slide. If you meant to advance them.
I did mean to advance them.
Okay. Well, what I can say is, so this is the first myth, and it's true because it says can. So yes, it can be difficult to deliver government digital services quickly, efficiently, and in a way that helps people in need. And I'm a procurement person. That's my background. I drink the Kool-Aid on technology, but to everything if you're a hammer, everything's a nail. But procurement-wise, I feel like it's true because in the federal government, at least, we are more prone to do, like, we come from a place where we did waterfall type procurements. So we used to take really long periods of time to gather requirements. I'm often never talking to users. Like, I didn't realize people talk to users until I came to 18F. I'm a procurement official, and I never had anybody sit down with me and say like, oh, what would you like in a procurement system? Like, never happened. And so, like, yeah, under like the older methods, the less modern methods of like acquiring technology and acquiring products, this is definitely something that was true because you focus on the end user.
Yeah, I guess folks maybe can see these slides advancing and maybe we can't. I see them advancing. It looks like there was some discussion in the chat about maybe Hopin being a little difficult sometimes, but if folks can see that, they can all see them. So,
oh yeah, we can totally see it now. I see it now as well. Sorry.
This myth is true. It is difficult to deliver government digital services quickly and efficiently. Doesn't mean it's impossible, but it's definitely a true thing. Here's the second one. Let's keep going with our myth busting here. So building and deploying digital services is cheap and easy, and government's regular failure to do so underscores a lack of technical expertise in the public sector. And Ashley, did you want to say anything about this one before we bust it or uphold it?
My comments to this myth is it's like twofold, right? Like the concept of cheap and easy, I don't like those terms. But like this is where in the federal government we have an evaluation method called LPTA, lowest price technically acceptable. This is where I feel like thinking things should be cheap becomes problematic, because at that point you're not evaluating for like quality. Yeah. You're only evaluating for price, and evaluating for price for things like that is if it was like a bottle of water, right? Yeah. Like the combination is H2O, and so it's all the same, and we literally are just like awarding based on a price. When it comes to technology, best value, that's what we call it in the federal government, is like absolutely the better evaluation method, because it could be cheap. It doesn't necessarily mean it's cheap. I will say this, I do think modern technology, especially like agile software development, is drastically cheaper than what is currently spent or what has been spent in the past. And when I see like headlines with like $500 million things or even $1 billion, like it makes me nervous, because at 18F we promote projects $10 million or lower for them to actually be successful, because we have different stats that show us above 10 million, a lot of IT projects are wildly unsuccessful. Yeah. So I don't think it's cheap in terms of time, money, skills, and effort, because it's collaborative, and transformation is hard, but transformation is rewarding.
Right.
So that's my thoughts there.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that the notion of cheap, I think, is an interesting one that we could dig into more. It shouldn't be prohibitively expensive to do this stuff, right? But I would push back a little bit on the idea that this sort of, validates that governments just are bad at stuff and that we don't have technical expertise. That's not true. I mean, the Code for America Summit is filled with people that have all sorts of technical expertise that work in and around government. So I think we can very easily say this is false, right? I want to move on to this third myth. This is a really interesting one, right? So if it's true that there are people that think that governments are just bad at stuff, it's also true that there are people, even people inside government, that think that the processes that we use to implement digital services, the procurement process, and something that's called the security accreditation process. This is basically the security approvals that you need to launch digital services, particularly in the federal government, but there's also state and local equivalents. There are people inside government that think these processes are broken and that they're just useless and we shouldn't do them. And I think one of the things that we want to talk about is we want to talk about some of the reasons we do these things and some of the principles that are embedded in these processes that we don't want to get rid of by simply, truncating these processes or circumventing these processes. So I think we can say that this myth is false, but then also it's kind of true, because these processes can be really difficult and painful, and they can, as we'll talk about in just a moment, they can take months. And I will say this, I actually have heard of security accreditation processes that have taken years, and that can be problematic. When you are listening to users and you want to iterate quickly to give them value, it really doesn't help if you can't deliver an iteration within 12 or 14 months. That's hard. So in this section, we're going to discuss some of the challenges to digital service delivery, and specifically why they exist. Why do these processes exist? Why do we have to go through them? And how we can go through them more effectively to deliver services to people that need them. But before we do that, I thought we'd maybe take a little bit of a look around, do a little bit of introspection. We've just gone through a period of about 15 or 16 months where digital service delivery was sort of under the microscope, right? We were in the headlines. There was lots of news about governments having to deploy new digital services, whether it was for vaccine sign-up or it was unemployment systems, you name it. It was quite a year. And I thought what I would do is I would try and capture just a couple of tweets that sort of capture the emotional arc of digital deployments, digital service deployments over the past year. So you had this one, right? This is, if y'all can see this, this is a tweet from a local news station in Virginia announcing the launch of an online system to pre-register for a vaccine, right? Yay! And then all of a sudden, same day, oh boy, the system's down, right? The system crashed due to high traffic. This was sort of the emotional arc we went through quite a bit over the past 15 months, right? Where something get launched, and then there was this huge influx of traffic where the system had problems, and there would be a notice that it was coming down. You don't have to look far to find examples of problems over the past 15 or so months. There was a lot of them. I mean, if you want to just Google unemployment system failure pandemic, you're going to get several hundred of these articles. It was all over the news. And what I thought would be interesting was just to try and quantify this. Like, what did this mean? All of these systems that had problems, how did it impact real people? And this was a study. This graphic comes from a study by the Economic Policy Institute that looked at unemployment claimants. This was done early in the pandemic. So this was done maybe April or May last year. So this was still early on. And what they found was that for every 10 applicants to state unemployment systems, there were 3 people that could not get through the process. And there were 2 people that didn't even try because they thought it was too difficult. So think about that. For every 10 people that did apply for benefits, there were 5 people that either tried to and couldn't get through, or 2 that just said, to hell with that, I'm not going to do it, it's too complicated. That's the cost of some of the things that we saw. And this quote is pulled from some research that was done by Project Redesign. Dana Chisnell, who's someone you should know and follow. She is brilliant. She is part of the greater CFA family. She did some research with, I forgot exactly who she did the research with, to be honest with you, but that's why the quote's at the bottom, or the link's at the bottom. But they did some research where they actually talked to real unemployment applicants, and this is what people were feeling. People felt trapped. They felt trapped in something that they didn't know how to get out of. So there's a real cost when these systems need to work for people, and they are unable to use them to get the help that they need. And of course, during all of these failures, and during all the media coverage of these failures, there were volunteer efforts to do things to help out, to create websites that would let people find or sign up for vaccine appointments. And I want to say, right up front, this is awesome, right? This is great. I'm someone who began my work in civic tech as a civic hacker, as someone who did this. And the people that made these websites should be congratulated, and we should collaborate with them more. But it was particularly the framing of this effort that really sort of, I think, sort of resonated with us. And there's also a really good blog post by Dan Hahn, who is he's also a member of the CFA family. I think it's called "The $50 Website You Don't Want." That his writing on this has heavily informed this presentation. But basically, this was the problem, right? The article basically says, hey, this person, this tech hero, created a website for $50 that government couldn't get its act together and do. I mean, I'm sort of paraphrasing, but that was the framing of this, right? And it creates all sorts of problems. Number one, we all know it costs more than $50 to create a government website. And Ashley and I will talk about some of the many reasons why it does. And some of those are very good reasons. It also perpetuates this sort of myth of, tech heroism, where, technical saviors are going to parachute into governments and just tell us how we're doing it wrong and just make everything all right. I think, we've sort of dispelled with that myth a long time ago. We know that the way to build better digital services is to do it from the inside, is to do it hand in hand with the people that are career government servants, that are on the front line serving people. So this framing of this article is really sort of at odds with what we know to be true. And it's easy, but the problem is that it's one that resonates, right? You can see how easily it slides into this meme from Arrested Development, right? And why wouldn't it resonate? If you look at the picture on the right, that picture was actually taken by one of our colleagues. it's something you see driving around. It's a placard that's nailed to a telephone pole, and I think this is in the greater Washington area. And people see this every day. Hey, we can do a website for under $250. So when they hear these stories about websites being done for $50, and they side by side, they see articles about governments that just can't get their act together, it's no wonder that this message sort of resonates, right? And that's unfortunate. Okay, Ashley, let me go back. Ashley, did you want anything you wanted to add?
In the comments, I think it's all covered.
Right. That picture on the right was taken in your neck of the woods. It was taken somewhere in the greater Washington area. So you may have seen it, or you may see one like it. All right, let's talk about some of the challenges to digital service delivery. We're going to bust this myth by talking about facts and the truth, right? I chose this quote to sort of frame this session because, well, number one, it's from John Jay, who wrote the fewest of the Federalist Papers. He wasn't a show-off like Hamilton or Madison. He made everyone count. I think he only wrote like 3 or 4. But this quote is about international treaties. But I thought it was really interesting because it sort of gets at this notion of transparency and immediacy, that there's this tension between those two things. If we want to be open and transparent and collaborative, then we can't be fast. We can't do things quickly. And I think that's an important tension to keep in mind as we talk about digital service delivery and some of the challenges that we face when we deploy digital services. Right. So this is the bottom line. Launching a digital service in government is hard, and it's hard for some really specific reasons. Right. We serve everyone. We cannot put a disclaimer on a digital service and say we're not going to serve you because it's inconvenient for us, or we didn't feel like implementing this particular feature, or whatever it is. We have to serve everybody. We're obligated to do that. We have to serve people in an equitable way, and there are laws and regulations which require us to make sure that everyone can be accommodated in the digital services that we deploy. And also the digital service that you see on the other end of your browser is just one part of a broad spectrum of services that governments provide. It isn't just the digital piece. Behind it, there are processes, there are people working hard, there are historical records, there are all sorts of things that those digital services are typically built on top of. And I should point out, when you see private volunteer efforts to build, vaccine websites, open data applications, these things are usually built on top of that foundation. They're leveraging the work that's done by public servants and by governments. And I'm not knocking that. I've done it myself. But we should be aware of it, that it's only a piece of a much broader spectrum that governments are responsible for. There are some other reasons why the experience of the past 15 months was what it was, right? Lots of states have made their unemployment systems hard, intentionally, right? And they make no bones about it. So it's really hard to use the unemployment systems in a state as a vector for relief when policymakers have either explicitly or implicitly made it harder to get those benefits, right? For folks that haven't read a book called Administrative Burden, by Pamela Hurd and Don Moynihan. It is essential reading. You should read it. The subtitle of that book is Policymaking by Other Means, and that's exactly what it is. When you put barriers in front of people to getting benefits that they need, or you set a system up making it intentionally hard, hoping to keep caseloads down, that's policymaking by other means. We need to call it out. But that's one of the reasons why using state unemployment systems as a vector for benefits was difficult. And it's also fair to say too that what we saw over the past 15 months was also partly a reflection of the chronic underinvestment in government IT. This is not a new problem, right? It seems like only crises, call people to action and get investment going in government technology. And there's chronic underfunding, and you're going to see that when a crisis materializes, and we need to use particularly a combination of federal, state, and local technology to deliver services and information. Oops, sorry, there's the link for that. But besides those things, there are some other factors that can slow down delivery of digital services in government, and they make projects more complex and more costly. And Ashley and I are going to talk about those things. So the first one is procurement, right? Ashley, did you want to jump in here, or just let me know? I can.
Let you start, and I'll jump in with my procurement lens.
Yep, you're gonna see a lot of similarities between this slide and the next slide, right? So procurement is governed by a labyrinth set of regulations. Ashley knows more about it than I ever will. I think I made it to core level 1, and I think that has now lapsed. So I'm really a layperson now. These requirements exist at both the federal and the state level. They are often not well suited for the acquisition of software development services. And they can also take many, many months, and in some cases years. And it is not atypical of them to involve litigation. If anybody's been following some of the news about, I won't say the name, but I'll just say it's a large technology procurement for cloud services at the federal level that often involves litigation. So this process can go on for years and years. Ashley?
Yeah, and I think here too is, and I say this as a previous like procurement official. I'm still a procurement official in a certain capacity, but like also we're like trained to be risk averse, right? And so like we're choosing methods within the regulation that probably are the most difficult to acquire software development services such as Agile. It requires like such a pivot and change in thought. The regulation totally has all the parts needed for us to embrace it in a way where it wouldn't take months and definitely not take years. But like even me as a person, I didn't discover that until I came to 18F, you know, and part of why I came to 18F was like, it felt like I was buying stuff really bad, you know, or like systems were landing after going off wherever they went for 2 years. And it was like not a system, or certainly not a system that satisfied users.
Right.
And it wasn't until I started working here that I learned like the methods and the skill set. So there's the regulation, but then there's always a human aspect. Like people always focus on technology, but you have to focus on the humans. And in this case, that's another big part that aligns with the FAR is like the skill set of most procurement officials in federal government.
Right. And this is another process, right? I talked about it before, accreditation. This is, if you're looking at that graphic on the right and you're wondering what the hell that is a graphic from, I think it's the NIST risk management framework. And I don't understand it either. But this is the process whereby a system gets approved from a security perspective to go into production, right? And just like procurement, there are labyrinth rules around it. There are probably state and local equivalents to this process, so that at the federal level it's required by law. FISMA is the law, the statute that requires it. It can impact how you design a system. So think of it this way: how you actually engineer a technology solution in government can be impacted by what your compliance requirements are going to be, right? And how you implement it. And again, just like procurement, this process can take many months, and in some cases it can take years. So the thing to keep in mind is that when you have processes in front of your delivery that can potentially take years, it becomes really, really hard to show value to users. You can listen to users, you can understand their needs, but you can't show them value. You can't iterate on that if you can't deliver within a reasonable amount of time. So collectively, we refer to these things as bureaucracy, right? Red tape, things that we don't really want to do. They're complex, they slow things down, they make things more expensive. If that's true, then why do we do them? If bureaucracy is the enemy of innovation and rapid delivery, then what good is it? So Ashley and I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the reasons we do these things, right? Let's chat about those briefly. So fairness and equity, right? Ashley knows this better than me, but one of the things we want to accomplish in the procurement process is we want to be open and fair. We want to give everyone a chance to bid on government work. We want to make sure that everyone has an equal chance to bid. This is why we do things like we post a solicitation publicly. We have to keep it up for a certain amount of time. This is why when you have vendor meetings, they're open, anyone can attend. Usually when there's a Q&A, keep me honest here, Ashley, I may be getting into hot water here. We post those vendor questions and answers so that everyone gets the benefit of seeing those things. We want there to be a level playing field, basically. And I think this is really important because we've talked a lot about how the makeup of a digital services team, and certainly people at this conference have very elegantly talked about how the makeup of a digital services team can affect that product and how it serves the people that need it. We need to make sure that we've given the right kind of firms a fair shake at getting this work.
Plus one to all those things. And, you know, we just had the slide on the FAR, and a lot of people do see the FAR as like one big book of bureaucracy and constraint, but it does promote good things like fairness and equity through like socioeconomic policy that you have to consider. You have to think about certain socioeconomic categories before you can just put a solicitation out to vendors. You have to think about competition requirements. There's laws, Competition and Contracting Act, Contract Disputes Act. If the government got it wrong, because like spoiler alert, sometimes the government gets it wrong.
Yeah.
So there's a process for that. And you know, as a woman of color, I always think about this in terms of like equity, not only in like vendors, like small minority businesses being more in the space, small businesses being more in the space, but Ruha Benjamin has like introduced this concept of the new Jim Code. Like instead of Jim Crow, there's this Jim Code thing where like technology is introducing more bias and more systemic racism. And if we don't bring on vendors that like look like the American public or that have that fair shot at the work and transforming our government, we could be a part of the problem thinking that we're doing something super benevolent, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. I also want to at least acknowledge too that, you know, in terms of the giving everyone a level playing field, we're about to see, I think, some very, very busy contracting shops, right? We've got relief money coming. That money's going to get spent by governments, and that money's probably going to go through a contracting office. And we want to make sure that contracting officers are, as Ashley said earlier, are looking at best value. They're not just looking at lowest cost, technically feasible. Jen Pahlka has a recent Medium post that is really just essential reading. It's about, I think the title of it is we're about to have our own Kill It With Fire moment. And Kill It With Fire is a really good book, and the details are in Jen's post. But if you can find that post, I would recommend reading it. It's a totally relevant argument because we've got a lot of money coming out now. It's going to go through contracting shops, and we need to make sure that that money is getting us best value and not just lowest cost. Transparency, right? More on this, the same thread, because we want there to be transparency in how government spends its money and how it selects vendors. We want there to be transparency in how much risk residual risk is in a system. This becomes especially important when we think about security of technology systems. These are all things that the procurement and accreditation process can help us get to. And also security and accountability, right? It's fashionable right now to say things like compliance isn't security. You Google that term and you'll see some people saying that. And it's not untrue, right? Just because you go through a compliance process doesn't mean your solution is automatically secure. Again, that's the red tape view of this process. But what accreditation does get you is accountability, right? Because it's like, it is a process of writing things down. It is a process of memorializing decisions in a technology solution so that you say, this is how we implemented this particular security control. This is why we did it this way. This is how much risk is left over in it. And I'll introduce a new term here. POAM, you see this at the bottom, POAMs. That's a plan of action and milestones. And if anyone knows what that term meant, then you are definitely someone who's gone through an ATO process before. But this is our colleague Alex Sobel, also I think in the Code for America family. He wrote this kind of cheekily, this poem for POAMs. And it immediately resonated with me because he talks about writing things down. Some things we did, we wrote those down. Some things we didn't, we wrote those too. That is essentially the accreditation process. It's a lot of writing things down. And while that doesn't get you security, it does get you accountability. So, and that's a thing we need to be conscious of in government. We have to be able to be held accountable for decisions that we make and for risk that we assume. And that's really what the accreditation process is trying to get us to.
Right. And the other thing about security, I'm just a procurement person. So like I leave that to folks like Mark who are like really good at it. But just from like a citizen perspective, government has to account for security things that like other folks might not have to account for, because some of the systems we build are for really vulnerable populations, right? And you have to make sure that those systems protect those folks, because that is a part of like civic duty, right? Protecting the most vulnerable in your country.
And so why does this matter? Why are Ashley and I talking about this stuff, right? I don't think either one of us is up here arguing that the procurement process always works, right? That it never stinks, that it always results in a good outcome. That's not what we're saying. I don't think we're saying that the accreditation process is perfect and that it isn't too slow sometimes and too much paperwork, too much red tape. We're not saying that. But since we imbue these processes with principles like transparency and accountability and openness and fairness, if the way we reform them is simply to truncate them or to circumvent them, then we have to be careful that we're not leaving these principles behind, right? We want to go faster, but we don't want to do it in a way that causes us to sacrifice our principles. We can do both. We don't have to choose one or the other. And I think that's kind of what Ashley and I want to talk about next. How do we deliver better digital services without giving up our principles? I don't know why I put this quote in here. I really just liked it. I really think it's a good quote. And it sort of harkens back to our discussion about how we did over the past 15 months and some of the bad press that people got. Hey, this is a tough field we're in, but there is no failure. We learn every time. We have to be able to learn from what we do. So let's talk about some ways that we can do better. We're going to talk about three main ways. Shared platforms, right? We're going to talk about how we borrow expertise from people that have already done something that we want to emulate. And we're going to talk about how we can do these things while maintaining our principles. But to set that up, consider this right now. These are not uncommon scenarios, right? Government agencies spend a ton of time setting up the infrastructure for their digital solutions. And it drives me insane, and I'm sure it does Ashley as well, to see agencies doing the same thing over and over and over again, right? The promise of open source is that that won't happen all the time, but it does happen quite a lot. And there are lots of ways that agencies rationalize doing this. But think about this on the right-hand side, just launching a new website in government, right? This is what you have to go through. You have to go through an acquisition process, typically. You have to create the content and maintain it, and you have to go through an ATO. It's not uncommon for that to take 6 months and cost almost $100,000. How can we fix that? How can we make that less of an impact? Well, one way is we can use shared platforms like cloud.gov. And full disclaimer, I work for the cloud.gov team, so I'm not an unbiased person. But to me, this is the way we can speed digital service delivery and maintain those principles that we talked about earlier, right? So cloud.gov is a platform as a service. You can rapidly deploy and iterate on production applications. It means that teams don't have to worry about infrastructure. The infrastructure is taken care of. And the other thing it does that I think is really impressive is it bakes in compliance. So solutions that are deployed on top of cloud.gov come with an immediate compliance. It lifts the burden of compliance on them significantly, not totally, but in a very significant way. This is the way we can speed up delivery and maintain accountability on compliance. Federalist is another platform that GSA also offers. This is a platform specifically for websites. That figure that I just mentioned to you, the 6-month $95,000 figure, I will tell you one story of Federalist was last year the CDC needed to put up a website, as you can imagine, with some frequently asked questions about coronavirus. There was obviously some political imperative to get this done quickly, but the Federalist team was able to get it built and deployed within 7 to 10 days. And in the federal government, that's a huge deal. That's a really big deal. Again, just like cloud.gov, it de-obligates product teams from worrying about the infrastructure or scaling. They just worry about producing good information or producing a good application. That's the power of the Federalist platform. Login.gov. I can't tell you how many times I read news articles over the past year about identity and identity management and authentication. It's obviously a big deal when you're giving people benefits. And we can have a whole other discussion. We probably have sometime at the summit this year about whether or not we should measure the success of a benefit on whether someone got it that shouldn't have got it, because that seems to be the metric we use right now, or whether it's more important to look at people that should have gotten the benefit that couldn't get it because the system was too complex. Login.gov makes this really simple. It's really easy to integrate with your solutions. I should say as well that Login.gov has been approved for state and local governments to use as well. So if you are interested, we'll have a link at the end of this presentation if you're a state or local government. And certainly if you're a federal agency and you want to use Login.gov, it's a terrific solution. And there's a team at 18F that worked on, we basically put this team together, a strike team, if you will, to look at the ATO process and how we could speed it up. And this team, like most of the stuff we do at 18F, was written up and published on our blog. They looked at this process, and one of the findings that they came up with in taking the ATO process from half a year to 30 days was that if we start to standardize on some of our infrastructure choices, if our systems don't look completely different, we can actually make the process go faster. And that to me was really a really interesting point. I think people kind of know that intuitively, but to see it come out of this this work was really affirming. The other thing for me that it kind of highlighted was that on the other side of this process, there are people. There are people that work at agencies who are what are called authorizing officials. And it's the same on the contracting side. There are contracting officers on the other side of the procurement process. We often think of these processes as broken, but they work for somebody. They work for these people. And we need to understand how they work for these people so that we can make them work more effectively for product teams. So keep that in mind when we talk about these processes. There are real people on the other side of these, and we can do things to make it easier for them. So we can keep the integrity of the ATO process or the procurement process, and also ensure that we don't give up on those principles that we talked about that are so important. I wanted to talk about a couple of things that 18F, and I'll pass over to Ashley as well. These are things that 18F has created and published for anyone to use, whether you're a federal agency, state or local government, it doesn't matter. On the screen, you should see the US Web Design System. This is a design system that was created by 18F that is now open source that anyone can use. A really, really impressive project was the de-risking guide. This was the development of a federal and a state and local guide for de-risking technology procurements. And then there's another bunch of guides that you can find linked from the 18F website that cover things like design, architecture, product, user research, you name it. Ashley, did you want to say anything on this?
What I love most about the de-risking guide is like in the federal government, Agile is like so new and such like a new space that some folks don't even know how to budget for it, right? Because you're not getting a thing, you're getting services towards building a thing that like constantly like pivots. And so it helps you not only budget for an Agile project, but it takes you all the way through procuring a vendor team to build the thing. So it's like an awesome resource. Thanks, Sarah, for dropping it in the comments. And we created a workshop out of it. So it's a really quick way. If you know anyone who like needs that kind of assistance, and we can do it for both state governments, and we can do it for federal offices as well. Oh, and then the last thing I'll say is the guides, the 18F guides. One of the things I love about it the most is like, somebody like me, I was newer to technology, so I didn't know all the different design things you could do. But it gives like folks who might not be familiar with the space really good guidance on the type of user research that you can do to not only like validate, but also I would say evaluate. So like now when folks come to me and they want vendors to come in and do demos, I say like, what about a usability test? Like, what about sitting an actual user in front this show pony thing, as opposed to somebody telling you like what a thing does? So all of those kinds of things I feel like helps with better vetting.
There's some other things that I'm going to throw out here we can talk about too. First is that GSA has procurement schedules that agencies can use. I may be stretching it here a little bit, but I almost think of these things as shared platforms as well, right? These are procurement vehicles that any agency can leverage. In addition, some state and local governments, not all of them, but some of them can use like Schedule 70 to buy digital services. 18F has published a ton of information, and I'll say to their credit, 18F has published a lot on the things that didn't go well. This block in the middle there is about a process that 18F embarked on several years ago to create agile vendor pools, and this is a really honest assessment of that. I think ultimately the organization decided to move on from this approach, but we've documented it for you. So if you want to try this, or if you're interested in learning more about it, you can come to our blog and you can read all about it. Everything we've learned, we publish and make available for folks. And in addition, 18F also publishes procurement materials, right? Solicitations. We do, I mean, this is not uncommon, right? Because this is required, but what 18F has done that is different is they're publishing on GitHub. What you're looking at now is a solicitation from a project with the US Tax Court. They actually put their technology solicitation on GitHub. That's a thing that's been talked about a lot, I think, at prior Code for America summits. All of this information and these materials are out there. So if you want a starting point, you don't know where to start, you can get a solicitation document, or you can get a QWASP. Ashley, could you drop in the chat what a QWASP is? Because I won't have a chance to do that. I hate to drop all these acronyms, but you can get these things from one of the 18F repos or our partner repos where we've done this.
And we put a lot of these resources in the de-risking guide, and a lot of them have been updated there. And the only thing I wanted to plug extra on GSA Mass is almost a lot of state governments can also use GSA Mass. It's over 7.5 million contractors on there, but don't let that like scare you for like IT services, which is why 18F uses it the most, because they have a really good pool of modern software development companies, and we almost always use IT services as the subcategory on Mass. They have 80% of those vendors are small business. So when we talk about that like equity issue, like there's already something built that has accounted for that kind of equity as well.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is a for folks that like this image, this was taken from a blog post written by our colleague Brett Mogilewski. I really love this phrase. He put it in the blog post. If we're going to be shipping, and that's what we want to do, we need a shipyard, right? And our shipyard is all the things that Ashley and I just talked about, all the shared platforms we talked about, all of the solicitation materials, all of the schedules, all of the stuff that's in Git repository. Those are the parts of our shipyard. We need those if we're going to ship quickly and effectively and successfully. So, to start wrapping up here, people malign bureaucracy, often with good reason. I guess what I think we're trying to do a little bit here is to help us think differently about why we do the things that we do. These are a couple of quotes that are pulled from a really good book by Mark Schwartz, who was a federal CTO. The book is called The Delicate Art of Bureaucracy. And what I always liked about these quotes is that it sort of ties back to principles that Ashley and I were talking about earlier. But effectively, that bureaucracy, it can be looked at as a way to memorialize the best practice, right? That's what we're trying to do. We want to make best practices repeatable, and we should keep that in mind as we talk about bureaucracy. So to start leaving you with a few takeaways, I think this is the main one. We don't want to cancel bureaucracy. Right? We don't want to get rid of all that red tape. We want to be able to work within it. We want to be able to innovate within it and not give up those principles that we talked about. It's not an either or. Those things are not mutually exclusive. And I think one of the things we want to do together as digital service teams and people working in this space is to find ways to innovate within the bureaucracy. All right, so I think we've effectively busted the myth. The myth of the $50 website, right? There is no such thing as a $50 website in government, because building equitable, quality, reliable digital services isn't cheap, right? The processes that make this hard in government exist for a reason, and we want to understand those reasons, and we want to find ways to deliver efficiently and successfully within those. Now, Ashley and I talked about this last slide just the other day. The person that you're looking at on the screen, and I'll explain why I'm sharing this with you in just a sec. His name is Andrew Hyder. He was our colleague. He passed away unexpectedly last week. Ashley and I were in a prep session actually together, going over this presentation when Ashley heard about it and we found out what happened. I think what we wanted to do was share this because the quote you're looking at on this slide. The kinds of websites I like to make are the ones that help people. That's why I'm in government. That was something that Andrew put in a profile that was shared with the rest of 18F. It's from his personal README. We have this thing where people put personal READMEs together. A README is like a document that goes into a Git repository. A personal README, you can find out more about those on the 18F website, on the 18F blog, I think. I thought it was really important to include this because, number one, Andrew was a really great person. He was a member of the CFA family and the 18F family. But what he stood for was so important. And I know that it was a difficult year for digital service delivery. There were a lot of articles about how government didn't pass muster, right? This is hard, what we do. It's hard, it's frustrating, it's easy to get burned out, it's easy to get demoralized. But I think we need to remember why we do the things we do, right? There are people that need help. They need our help, and they need government to work well for them when they are in need. That is the thing that Andrew believes. And when we're struggling with, our own self-doubts, when we haven't lived up to the public's expectations, when we haven't lived up to our own expectations, I think it's important to understand why we're doing this. We're doing this because there are people that need our help, and we're here to help them. Let's not forget Andrew. Let's not forget what Andrew dedicated his life to. And that is it. I'm going to leave you with some links. I think you want to go to the Q&A, Ashley, and maybe take some questions?
I'm like so excited for these questions.
I know. I haven't had a chance to look at this yet, so.
I've never seen a group that could like rapid fire pull all the links that fast. Like I feel like the links were already there before they got to the slide. I'm going to go in order of how they came in. So the first former 18Fer, Elizabeth Goodman. How will the IDEA Act affect digital service deployments?
So I mean, go ahead.
I was going to say I'll let you take that one.
I mean, so I think that the IDEA Act is, and I'm certainly not an expert in the IDEA Act, but it does have specific requirements for how digital services need to be engineered. And anytime you have a specific set of requirements, it's going to add. It can add cost. It can add time. I think one of the nice things about the shared services that we talked about, particularly Federalist, is that we have a bunch of website templates that agencies can use to start with that have IDEA Act compliance already built in, so they don't need to do it themselves. They can start from a template that has it already baked in. I apologize, Elizabeth. I don't know if that's a really great answer, but I think anytime we add requirements, there was someone at 18F had this really interesting insight into how we create policies like this. It's almost always additive. Our way to getting at better outcomes is additive. We add requirements, we add new restrictions, we do these things. I think anytime we do that, we potentially add cost or time. But there are ways to make that, to lift that burden. And I hope that answers your question.
If you go to U.S. Web Design Standards page on digital.gov, those standards as listed totally account for all the things that IDEA Act accounts for. So like, I'm a procurement person. I don't know all the things about it, but one of the things that I know I've talked to 18F about is just applying those the U.S. Web Design Standards to like many of the things that our partners bring us, because it does account for all the list. There's a list of things in the IDEA Act. Okay, next question, and this got like 5 likes. We all want equity in procurement, but it's far from fair for SMEs, MWBs, bureaucracy, period. Bureaucracy is designed for fairness in theory, but in practice, there is systematic bias. How does this look in digital services? I'll start off with this. Thank you for this question. Keisha, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I agree with you. And one of the things that I know, like one of the things that we've started doing at 18F is like, talking to like more minority businesses, like asking them, how they feel when they see a solicitation, like what's understood, what's not understood. TTS is about to start something called Industry Days. And one of the sole focuses of one of those industry days will be like equity and procurement, because we recognize that that's not the case, especially because in the past, government did really large dollar procurements. And I think Mark spoke to like a lot of the security issues. So it was almost like prone for these large businesses that are not as diverse and don't take into account a lot of other things, right? And so now that we're moving to a more modular place in procurement, more folks are moving towards agile. I think more folks, just because of like the spirit of agile and how design thinking is happening, now we're thinking more about equity. And so I just think it's a part of this big ship that has to be, that's being changed. And I'm proud to say that I'm at TTS and 18F, where like, we're trying to be a big part of that. Mark, do you have any thoughts?
I was going to jump to another question because I think we're getting to time here, but I did want to say, I mentioned some services that were available to federal agencies and state and local governments. So currently 18F can work with state and local governments under certain circumstances, typically if it's procurement focused. Also, login.gov has been approved currently for state and locals as well. If you are interested in any of the other things we talked about, whether it's something that appears on the 18F website, in a GitHub repository somewhere, or any of the services like cloud.gov or Federalist, the easiest way to make an inquiry about those is, I would say, inquiries at cloud.gov. And we will, certainly knowing that state and local governments would be interested in those platforms would be super helpful, but we can probably direct you to these other resources as well. I don't want to miss any.
A lot of questions. So maybe, hopefully we can answer some of these outside of the presentation. One that seems easy though is, are these 18F tools open source? All of the resources are totally public. Mark, I'll let you speak to like the products, login, cloud, etc.
Yeah, almost all of our stuff is open source. It's in the cloud.gov GitHub organization. For obvious reasons, some stuff can't be open sourced. But I should say too, we are also ourselves consumers of open source technology. The cloud.gov platform is built on something called Cloud Foundry, which is an open source project that was spun out of Pivotal. And on almost all of our projects, we look to open source tools and products as the foundation for the work we do.
Okay, let's see if we can squeeze in one more. This one got 8 likes, so I'm gonna ask it, what are other potential shared platforms that could be built and shared across government? Oh, that's the $1 million question.
Yeah.
I have so many thoughts. Like, in my dream world, and I always like want technologists to like check me if it's like too pie in the sky, but like in my dream world, like government builds like these open source systems that we all of us are buying separately. State governments are buying them, federal agencies are buying them, local governments are buying them. But at the federal level, we build these open source systems that everyone can somehow fork and then like put their nuance in, and like the federal government start like taking care of that vendor layer, right? And so at that point, all the states, all the federal agencies, they're not having to like worry about contracting for these things separately. They're not have to worry about like negotiating costs for these things separately. Like that is my dream world. And I think there are certain systems that just like inevitably across everything. For example, grants, right? Like if there was like some open source grants modernization system. But that is the reflection of my thoughts. I'm not saying there are anybody else's thoughts here.
I mean, I agree. I have so many thoughts on this, right? I mean, I look at things from the UK, like they have a tool called Notify that I think was picked up by the Canadian government and actually implemented there as well. I often find myself wondering why we have 50 different solutions to deliver unemployment benefits to people. We have these conversations a lot at TTS, but so there's a ton of potential, right? There's a ton of ways to make, and I don't know that the answer is necessarily that we say, here's this system, this whole thing, right? This turnkey system. I think there's enormous potential to say, here are pieces of a system, right? Here's parts of a thing that you're going to need. Login is a great example of that. You're going to need authentication and user management. Here's a way you can do that. All right, you're going to need this other piece of a system to do something else. Maybe it's a process of making different components of a system available, and governments can assemble those based on how they need them. But certainly, we can all agree that there's huge potential for shared platforms across governments, because clearly building 50 different unemployment systems ain't working.
Have time for one more. Is it over at 4:30?
I'm staying until they kick me out, so okay. We can take as many as we want. Yeah.
Or this one got 6 likes. Can you talk a little about reusing code from other governments to accelerate deployment? What are the pros and cons of this approach?
Oh, I mean, we sort of already started to talk about this, right? I mean, I think this is part of the shared platform conversation. 18F does a ton to promote code reuse, and I think everything we do is in the open. So we want governments to reuse stuff. I will say I think it's harder than we anticipated, and it certainly is harder than you would think it would be in theory. For the same reason that open source is hard sometimes normally, right? I mean, if you want to reuse a solution from one state to another, there are necessarily technology decisions that go into that, right? What if the technology choice that was made in the thing that was open source just isn't a technology that I can support in my state? Let's say the tool, whatever it was built in Python or Ruby, and I'm a .NET shop. These are legitimate questions about whether or not a government can implement and sustain an open source solution. But I do think this is what makes platforms as a service and software as a service more interesting for governments, because there isn't that question of, oh, I've got this new technology I've got to maintain. But I think at the end of the day, I think there's huge potential here. My own personal opinion is that it is harder to do than we might think it would be. And I think the evidence of that is that we don't see it happening a lot. We see it happening, but we don't see it happening like all over the place.
Okay, it's 4:29.
Yeah, I think we're at time. This has been a really great session. I wanted to thank everyone that joined, and thank you, Ashley. And thanks to Code for America for organizing this. I can't imagine that it's easy to organize a summit in these times. So thank you for bringing everybody together.
Yeah, this is my first Code for America, so this is super exciting. I love this group. I can't wait for next year, and I hope I can stay in touch with you all, like outside of this.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. Appreciate it.